Okay. Good evening, Miss Deborah. Happy Friday. Crap. Got hair dye on my shirt. Oh well, whatever. It's fine. Oh, thank you. How sweet. You're welcome. Yeah, my week has been very busy. Very busy. Work has been keeping me on my toes. Very much so. I hope your week was good. I hope everyone's week was good. Oh. My goodness, we're nearing the end of our book already, guys. Real quick, can everybody who's present, can you guys hear me? All right. Give me a thumbs up or heart or something. Thank you. Excellent. Okay. So what time is it? 8:02. Okay. Like normal, I'm going to give it till 5 after, just for people to log on and catch up. Do we have anybody new with us today? Anybody new who's with us for our reading? Because if you are, that's okay. If you stick around for what we're reading from Cleopatra's Daughter. Oh, okay, well, scared yet? So we're reading from Cleopatra's Daughter, and as you can see, we've only got this much left, so you've missed a good bit, but I have all of the pre-recorded readings from the past chapters on my YouTube page. And if you go to my bio here on TikTok, you can see, click the little Instagram icon and it'll take you to my YouTube account. And I have all listed in order, all of the readings of this book and the previous book that we had just finished. So you can catch up if you'd like, because you're probably going to be a little bit lost with who everybody is and what's happening and why is this stuff important. But it's still going to be entertaining. The next several chapters and up to the end, it's going to be very, very entertaining, even if you technically don't know what's going on. So I encourage you to stick around. But if you just get far too lost, you've got a chance to catch up, and this recording will be on as well, probably in the next day or two, once everything's done processing. But basically, just a real quick recap. So this book is essentially about the 3 children of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Well, we're down to 2 kids now because the youngest one unfortunately died very early on in the story, so we're still following the eldest son and the daughter, obviously. So they have found themselves in Rome. They are prisoners of war, basically. Antony and Cleopatra at this point are dead, and they are living as guests, but they're basically political prisoners of Caesar Octavian, and they are living with his sister Octavia, and there's political turmoil. There's you're diving in deep into everyday Roman life in this book. It's a really great read. It's a really great representation of what societal the hierarchy system was like, what it meant to be part of certain families, and roles between masters, slaves, men, women, the rich, the poor. It dives into all of that in this book. But there's so much. This is a book that just keeps moving. There are no stagnant bits in this book. It's like as soon as one thing has kind of resolved itself, you've got something else waiting in the wings to happen. So it's a very easy read. It's a very entertaining read. So if you've never read this book before, I highly encourage you to go out and either listen to me read it or go on Amazon and find a copy of your own, because it really is a great read. So, with Rilo, don't be simple. Anyway, without further ado, let's get started. All right. Before we left for Pollio's villa, an augur was summoned to determine whether the day would be auspicious for dining with a friend. We stood in the colonnaded garden beneath the increasing heat of the sun, waiting for a flock of birds to pass overhead so that the augur could divine from their pattern of flight whether this would be a dies fastus or a dies nefastus. Tiberius sighed heavily, and Marcellus looked immensely bored with the whole procedure. "Where are the damn birds?" Octavian swore. Oh, sorry. The title of the book is Cleopatra's Daughter by Michel Moran. Moran. Oh, and if you have the book, we're currently on page 286. The augur shifted nervously on his feet. "I am afraid the gods do not work on mortal schedules, Caesar." Livia pointed wildly to the north. "Blackbirds!" she exclaimed, and everyone turned to face the augur. Julia closed her eyes, and I could almost hear her thoughts. "Please proclaim it a dies nefastus." The augur spread his arms. There will be good fortune today," he announced. "This is a fastus." Tiberius stood swiftly. "Good. Let's go." I saw Juba smile wryly at him, while Octavian gave his thanks to the augur. A dozen curtained litters were waiting for us outside the villa, and I shared mine with Julia. "I was hoping he'd declare it a dies nefastus," I admitted as the litter began to move. "I knew he wouldn't. All the augurs look at my father's face before making a proclamation. If he doesn't look as if he wants to go, then it's a dies nefastus." "So your father doesn't really believe in it?" Julia's eyes went wide. "Of course he does. But how? He believes what he wants to, just like you with your Isis." "And what does that mean?" "Well, have you ever seen her?" Julia challenged. "Has she ever come to you in a moment of need?" "Isis works her miracles unseen." Julia cocked her head and gave me a disbelieving look. "You believe what you want to." I refused to dignify her insult with a response. Instead, I pushed open the curtains and looked out at the blue expanse in front of us. Villas were strung along the rim of the sea like pearls, bright white and gleaming in the sun. "Hello, Gianna. We are reading Cleopatra's Daughter." "You see that villa over there?" Julia asked. "That's Pollio's." I had intended to be angry with her, but instead I inhaled. "The one as large as a city?" "Yes, and wait until we go inside," she said resentfully. "It's bigger than anything you've ever seen. Even the palace at Alexandria," she promised. Julia wasn't lying. Although his villa in Rome had been sprawling, Pollio's villa on Capri had been built to house more than 3,000 people, most of them slaves. The walk was more than a mile from his handsomely frescoed portico to the gilded triclinium, where the stars in the ceiling were made from silver, and the sun on the wall from beaten gold. And as Pollio escorted us through chamber after chamber, he pointed out his newest purchases. "That is an authentic Myron," he said, naming one of the most famous Greek sculptors in the world. "And that is my eel pool." "Eels?" Octavia made a noise in her throat. "What for?" "Entertainment. Would you like to see them?" He didn't wait for her answer before leading us to the far corner of the atrium, to a vast pool large enough to fit a small boat. But no one would have attempted to sail on that lake. Beneath the murky waters, sharp-toothed fish writhed between the rocks. What sort of man kept eels for entertainment? I didn't step to the ledge, and I noticed that even Marcellus kept his distance. "Where do they come from?" he asked. Pollio made a grand gesture with his arm. "All across Capri. I have my slaves find them for me." "That must be very dangerous," Juba remarked. Pollio smiled. "It is. Shall we see them feed?" When no one objected, he ordered a slave boy to bring him a handful of rotten meat from the kitchens. When the boy returned, he was careful not to step too close to the pool. "Your meat, Domine." "Go ahead," he ordered the child. "Throw it." The boy trembled. "Me, Domine?" "Yes, this is Caesar who's waiting." The slave boy moved timidly toward the ledge, then quickly tossed his handful of meat into the pool. Pollio watched proudly as the eels swarmed around the offering, snapping their jaws and attacking one another in order to get to the food. Their teeth gleamed like small razors in the lamplight, and Octavia suggested faintly, "Shall we continue?" Pollio looked up. "Oh, yes, but did you see how they attack?" he asked Octavian eagerly. "They're vicious, absolutely vicious creatures." We walked past elaborate partitions made from ivory and a wooden chair whose back was carved in the shape of an eagle. "Every piece in this villa has a story," Pollio boasted. "That chair once belonged to a Gallic chieftain." "Vercingetorix?" I asked. Pollio looked surprised, as if a bird had opened its beak to speak to him. "That's right, and over there is my newest addition," he said, "a second library for my collection." "What about a second triclinium?" Livia said shortly. "One that doesn't require a litter to get there?" Pollio laughed loudly at what was obviously meant to be a criticism. "I already have 2 triclinia. Can you imagine the first villa to have 3? Of course, if Caesar were to suggest it, I would be more than happy—" "My wife was joking," Octavian snapped. "Of course," Pollio laughed nervously. "Who could afford 3 rooms for dining?" We came to the summer triclinium, where Horatia was waiting patiently for her guests in an exquisite tunic of apricot and gold. Immediately her eyes met Julia's, and I could see that she wanted to speak privately with her, but she did her duty and politely escorted the guests to their couches. The tables overlooked the water, and the warm wind smelled of sea salt and wine. "Just like Alexandria," my brother sighed, patting down his chair. "Did you spend your entire lives near the sea?" Marcellus asked. Julia and Tiberius seated themselves on opposite sides of him, while across the room Pollio and Horatia would be eating with Octavian. "Every day, playing in the water, collecting seashells by the rocks." "I'd like to go to Egypt," Julia said wistfully, and I wondered how many times a day she wished she were somewhere else. "Someday," Marcellus whispered, "if I become Caesar, we'll return Alexander and Selene to their thrones, and in return they'll show us Alexandria." Julia looked at her father. Now that winter was over, the color had returned to his cheeks, and he appeared strong. "That could be many years," she said fearfully. "Already wishing death on Caesar? That's how treachery begins," Tiberius warned. "No one said anything about death," Marcellus said, but Tiberius grinned. "I know what she meant." "You don't know anything," Julia retorted angrily. "You smile and listen like a sickly cat hoping for a scrap of meat to run to my father with. You think I don't know that you tell him everything we say." He snorted. "As if I cared enough to do that. Try Juba. He's the spy." But Julia sat forward. "You hope that if you tell my father everything, he'll trust you enough to send you to war alongside Agrippa. Maybe even make you a general. And you'll never have to come back here," she snorted. "But that's never going to happen. My father will keep you here, dancing like his puppet until he's gone. The heir," she looked from Marcellus to Tiberius, "and the spare." There was a crash of crystal on the mosaic floor, and everyone turned. "You stupid son of an ass!" Pollio shouted. He leapt from his chair, thundering toward the old man, who cowered on the floor. "Please, Domine, I didn't mean—" Pollio lashed out with his foot, kicking the slave squarely in the jaw. The old man fell back against the shattered glass, and Horatia rushed from her couch. "Please, "Pollio! This is the finest crystal we own!" he shouted. Julia and Tiberius exchanged glances. Their own bickering was silenced. "This Asinus has broken one of my largest vessels. Octavia wanted to know why I have eels?" He turned to the guards at the door of the triclinium. "Take him to the pool." The old man clasped his hands before his bloodied face. "Please, Domine," his voice became hysterical. "Please, kill me here, but not the eels." I looked from Agrippa to Juba, desperate for one of them to do something. Then Octavian stood. He held his crystal goblet in front of him, dropping it on the floor and watching it shattering to 1,000 pieces. No one spoke. No one even dared to breathe. Octavian proceeded to smash every piece of crystal on his table. The pieces scattered across the floor, and some of the children covered their ears at the terrible sound. At last, when there was nothing more to destroy, Octavian asked, "Will you be feeding me to the eels as well?" "Of course not, Caesar," Pollio said. The old man had tears in his eyes. "How many men have you killed this way?" "7," the old man whispered from the floor. "And all of them deserved it?" Pollio challenged, his chins wagging with indignation. "And this slave, does he deserve it?" Octavian asked. Pollio considered his answer before speaking. "Not with an example such as Caesar before him," he said wisely. "He was not as great a fool as he looked." "You are generous, Domine," the old man said. He trembled, and the sight was pitiful. Octavia turned away. "Yes, Dominus Pollio is very generous," Octavian said. "So generous, he will be freeing you tonight." Horatia gasped, but for the first time Pollio had the sense to bow his head humbly and accept Octavian's pronouncement. The next morning, on every temple door in Capri, the Red Eagle posted his first actum in praise of Caesar. Hello, Philly. Hello, Angel. I'm glad you guys could join us this evening, or today, wherever you happen to be on the planet. It became the subject of every conversation for the next 2 weeks. Clearly the Red Eagle had come out of hiding now that enough time had passed since the kitchen boy's crucifixion. But where was he residing on Capri, and how had he known what had happened in Pollio's villa? "Perhaps it is one of Pollio's clan," Marcellus speculated, dangling his feet in the swimming pool. The 4 of us were drying off in the sun. Since we were no longer in Rome, Julia and I were allowed to swim, but only inside the villa where no one could see us in our breastbands and loincloths. "Or it could be anyone who heard the news from Pollio's villa," my brother said. In the days after Pollio's slave had been freed, people as far away as Pompeii came to know of what had happened. We watched as Vipsania splashed at the other end of the pool, completely naked. Both Julia and I, though, now had something to cover. I noticed Marcellus was watching us with new interest, Julia in particular, whose wet band of cloth pressed against her breasts. I had the unkind urge to get up and block his view. "But if it's someone who has visited Pollio," Julia reasoned, "the person must be wealthy. Pollio doesn't admit any other kind." "What about a slave in his house?" I asked, "or one from this house who's been here?" But my brother frowned. It wouldn't be like a slave to compliment Octavian. The speculation continued throughout the summer, and everyone was suspect, even Juba and Agrippa. But there were no more acta on Capri, and the Praetorian Guard stationed at every temple door idled their nights away rolling dice and watching owls hunt for prey. By the end of August, Octavian announced a reward of 5,000 denarii to anyone with useful information on the Red Eagle. "Who do you think it might be?" I asked Vitruvius. We sat in the library with the final plans for the Temple of Apollo. A grand staircase swept from Octavian's home to the temple, where a vast library already housed his favorite literature. In a few days, when we returned to the oppressive heat of Rome, the last touches would be added and the temple would be dedicated. "If I knew," Vitruvius said, "I would be 5,000 denarii richer. Now, find me the measurements for the landing." "Is there going to be a mosaic?" I asked eagerly. Vitruvius smiled. "We will include the one you sketched. I gave a little cry of joy. After nearly a year of working with Vitruvius, this was the first design of mine he was going to use. I had sketched mosaics for Octavian's mausoleum and the column designs for Agrippa's Pantheon, but none of them had been included. Don't grow too excited, Vitruvius warned. We have to finish by October, and you're going to oversee the laying of the tiles. I didn't care how much work it meant, or how many hours before the ludus I would have to rise to oversee the mosaicist's work. When I told my brother, he stopped packing his trunk to look up at me. "And you want to do this?" "Of course. Why wouldn't I?" "Because we're about to return to the sweltering heat. How will you be able to work?" "It will be morning, and I don't have to suffer the way you do." "I'll never understand it," he said enviously, closing his trunk. "Only you and Octavian can endure it. Our mother would never have survived." Alexander seated himself next to me. 2 years ago, our mother and father had been alive. Ptolemy had been running through the palace halls with Charmian chasing after him, threatening to pinch his ear. There had still been hope of saving Egypt then, but now it was lost, and there was no telling whether we would ever return. What do you think will happen if Octavian determines not to send us back? Exactly what we've thought all along. He'll find us marriages, and we'll remain in Rome. And doesn't that frighten you? Of course it does, but what can we do? I was quiet for a moment. If Caesar died, I whispered, Marcellus would return us to Egypt. My brother's gaze immediately went to the door. Be careful, Celine. There's no telling who's listening in this villa. Marcellus thinks the Red Eagle is working with someone inside. Like Gallia? It's possible. He stood and opened the door. When he was sure there was no one outside, he closed it again and came back to my couch. In 5 months, Marcellus is going to have his toga virilis ceremony. Has he told you about this? I shook my head. At 15, every boy puts aside his bulla and becomes a man. Octavian will probably announce Marcellus's official engagement to Julia, and if he does, it will be clear to everyone who his heir is intended to be. Octavian will want to catch the Red Eagle before this happens. He can't afford to be embarrassed at such an important time. Be very careful what you say and to whom you say it. Why? You don't think he suspects us? I don't know, but even Agrippa's and Juba's chambers have been searched. I made a face. I know, he said. They're desperate. Has Gallia's name ever been mentioned? I don't think so, but it's impossible to know whom the Praetorian Guard are watching, including Marcellus. I was quiet for a moment. And what does Marcellus say about marriage? My brother gave me a long look. Nothing you want to know about. Oh, Tracy. Okay, I'll call you Tracy. So he's in love with Julia? I exclaimed. I don't know. But what does he say? My brother hesitated. That she is beautiful, and that they have the same passion for the circus. But she doesn't even care about the circus. She only goes for him. What do you want me to tell you, Celine? He's mentioned that he thinks you're pretty. He has? Many men think so, he said dryly. But what else has he said? That's it. I'm sorry. You know whom he's promised to. You're wasting your time thinking about him. That afternoon, ebony litters were arranged to carry us to the ship. No one was particularly happy about leaving, least of all Marcellus, who couldn't bear the thought of returning to the steam bath that was Rome. If we had vacations like every other family, he complained on the portico, we'd be here until October. I don't believe we're like every other family, his mother reminded him. Yes, Tiberius said mockingly, there is the small matter of governing Rome. That's what the Senate is for. So when you're Caesar, is that what you plan to do? Tiberius asked Marcellus. Give the reins of government to the senators and sit back while they steer? Octavian appeared, and everyone fell into an uneasy silence. Wave goodbye to the do-nothings, he said as he crossed the threshold of his palace. This is the happiest day of their year. Livia laughed, and Octavia smiled fleetingly at her brother's strange sense of humor. But Marcellus crossed his arms over his chest. I'm tired of the ludus, he grumbled, and he turned to find a sympathetic ear in Julia. I don't want to wait until I'm 17 to leave school. I don't think I can stand it for another 2 years, especially not when we could be here. She patted his arm. It's better than hard labor, she said teasingly. Celine, she turned to me, why don't you ride with your brother? Julia climbed into a litter after Marcellus, and I watched their shadows on the curtain for a moment before my brother pulled me into a second litter. Don't obsess about it, he said sensibly. Just be glad he doesn't want you. I stared at him in amazement. Well, how would that turn out? He demanded. What do you think Julia would do? Turn against me? He nodded. She's not all pretty tunics and jewels. I notice you stare at her, though. My brother laughed. I have no interest in Julia. Trust me. Why? I thought you said she's beautiful. Well, she is. She also belongs to Marcellus. And no matter how much we may wish otherwise, he said darkly, that's not going to change. I thought of Julia and Marcellus laughing together in the litter next to ours, but their shadows growing closer and closer, and tears of frustration blurred my vision. My brother put his arm around my shoulders, and I let tears roll down my cheeks. Then I noticed I wasn't the only one. My brother's handsome cheeks were wet, but I was too absorbed in my own misery to ask why. February 27. A few months after our return from Capri, Octavian dedicated the temple of Apollo, and the feast that followed lasted until the early hours of the morning. But it was nothing compared to the reception being planned for Tiberius and Marcellus, who had both turned 15 recently and would now celebrate their coming of age during March's festival of Liberalia. Julia insisted on new tunics for the ceremony, and wasn't satisfied with the bolts of cloth we had purchased over the winter holiday. This has to be something special, she'd said as February drew to a close. She'd begged her father to let Gallia take us to the Forum Boarium, where barges from Ostia unloaded their goods. This way we could barter for cloth before any other woman in Rome had a chance to see it. He finally agreed a week before Liberalia, with 7 of the Praetorian guards we followed Gallia into the cattle market. How can anyone stand this? Julia complained, holding up a ball of amber to her nose. It was your idea, Gallia reminded. But look at these people. They're so poor. Gallia gave me a weary look. Welcome to Rome. Unsatisfied with Gallia's response, Julia turned to me. Have you ever seen so much dirt? I'll bet these people don't even bathe. It's their work, I said. They can't help it. Dealing with cattle all day. Even so, she passed her hand in front of her nose. If my father wasn't so obsessed about his reputation among the plebes, he could have ordered the bargemen to just bring their cloths to the Palatine. The odor of cattle excrement was really overwhelming. On either side of the road, concrete apartment buildings teetered 3 and 4 stories high, and I wondered how the inhabitants could live with such stench and noise around them. We passed the bronze bull that occupied the center of the marketplace, and Gallia warned us to watch for cut-purses. You never know what sort lurks around here, and sometimes a woman screamed on the other side of the Forum Boarium, and suddenly people were running. Julia grabbed my arm. What is it? She cried. For a moment we couldn't see anything. Then a space cleared in the middle of the forum, and Gallia shouted, Bulls! The guards fanned out around us, but as the 2 animals charged, the soldiers scattered. Julia and I pressed ourselves against the side of an apartment building. As the bulls drew closer, Gallia shouted, Move! But there was nowhere for us to run. I closed my eyes as the first bull charged past us through the open door of an apartment building, missing us by a hair's breadth. But the second bull lowered its head. It had no intention of following its brother, and as it ran toward us, Gallia's screams rang out like a whistle. Then, suddenly, the massive bull staggered, and from the corner of my eye I caught a glimpse of blonde hair and a bow and arrow on the balcony of an adjacent building. A second arrow pierced the air, then a third and a fourth. The bull bellowed with rage, turning to see where the attack was coming from. In those precious moments, a soldier leapt forward and speared the beast with his metal pilum. The bull collapsed at Julia's feet, and when I looked up to see the blonde bowman, he was gone. But men were still shouting in front of us, and 2 of Octavian's guards leapt over the bull and dragged us away from the building. Above our heads, the first bull was roaming the balconies. A crowd of shouting merchants were warning anyone inside the building to flee. The bull didn't understand its confinement, and in its anger it was pushing its horns into the rails and ramming the walls again and again. Then there was a terrible crack, and the bull looked up as if it sensed what was about to happen. The balcony gave way, and in a shower of concrete the bull fell to its death where Julia and I had been standing. There was a moment of shocked silence from the crowd. Then a sound like thunder rumbled above us as the upper stories began to crumble. "Go!" one of the guards shouted, and the men ran with us before we could be engulfed in dust and debris. When we stopped to look behind us, the upper floor of the apartment building was gone. Julia began to shake. Our tunics were covered in dust, and merchants from across the Forum Boarium were running to see what had happened. "The man in the balcony," she trembled. "He saved our lives." We looked to the apartment balcony where the bowman had been standing, and one of the guards approached the building. As he reached the door, he stepped back quickly. "Gaius, Livius, take a look at this." We followed the men to the door. Fastened with the same type of arrow that was used to fell the bull, an actum had been posted about the mistreatment of slaves on the Aventine. At the bottom of the sheet of papyrus, written in hasty lettering, the rebel had added, "So long as freedmen and slaves are forced to live in buildings made of thin brick walls and concrete mixed with more water than lime, there will be deaths. And those deaths stain Caesar's hands." There was a frenzy of excitement as people around us realized who the archer must have been. The guards Octavian had sent with us burst into the building and raced up the stairs. Julia gripped my hand. "Do you think he's still up there?" "No," Gallia said. "He's probably long gone." "But what would he be doing here?" I asked. "Many men keep several apartments," Gallia said. "This could be his 3rd or 4th home." When the guards returned, they were carrying bottles of ink and a copy of the same actum that was posted on the door. The eldest of the guards introduced himself as Livius. His short gray hair exposed the hard, chiseled planes of his face. When he looked first at Julia, then at me, "What did you see when those arrows killed the bull?" Julia hesitated. A man on the balcony." "And what did this man look like?" "I couldn't tell." Livius's eyes bored into mine. "I couldn't tell either," I added swiftly. "A bull was headed right for us." "Why?" Gallia asked. What have the landlord said?" "He tells us he's never seen the tenant in that room." "But someone must have rented it," I exclaimed. Livius smiled slowly. "He says that money simply appears whenever the rent is due, and that men don't ask questions in the Forum Boarium." "That's true," Gallia offered. "It may be true," Livius returned hotly, "but no man is invisible. Someone has seen him, someone in that building. And when Caesar hears of this," he warned, crumpling the Red Eagle's actum in his hand, "the men he sends won't be interested in excuses." We began the walk back to the Palatine, and Julia whispered, "Marcellus and Alexander will never believe this. I told them they should have come with us instead of going to the circus." Her fear had turned into excitement with the appearance of the actum, and even though our shopping trip was aborted, she remained in high spirits. "We'll return tomorrow," she promised gaily, "and we can show them where we were almost killed." "There may have been people who died inside that building," I chided. "And there would have been 2 more if the Red Eagle hadn't saved us." When we returned to Octavia's villa, Julia wanted everyone to know how we had almost lost our lives, and that evening in the triclinium she repeated the story. "That's when the Red Eagle saved us," she said breathlessly. Her father lowered the scroll in his hands. "What?" Julia looked uneasily at me before returning to Octavian. "It was him. He shot the bull just as it was coming toward us. Didn't the guards tell you?" I could see that Livia was growing enraged, but Octavian remained perfectly calm. "And how do you know it was the rebel?" he asked evenly. because the same kind of arrow was used to hold the actum to the door. Marcellus whispered severely, "Stop talking." But Octavian was already on his feet. Obviously, the guards hadn't told him. When they had reported finding the Red Eagle's apartment, they had failed to mention the fact that the rebel had saved Julia and me. Octavian seated himself on Julia's couch and put his arm tenderly around her shoulders. "So he saved you." "From death," she said. "Right, Selim?" I nodded. "And did you get a chance to look at him?" I could see Alexander and Marcellus holding their breaths. I don't know." "This is very important," Octavian said gently. "See if you can remember." Julia frowned. Yes, I did. He had flaxen hair and strong arms." Octavian stood. "Thank you," he said. "Tomorrow, buy whatever silks you would like." Julia grinned, clearly proud of herself. "Hello, Thomas." That evening, in the privacy of my chamber, I railed against Julia's foolishness. What is the matter with her? My brother sat on his couch and shook his head. "A man's life is at stake," I cried. "And it may be someone she loves." He leaned forward and his voice dropped low. "Marcellus wasn't at the circus this afternoon." "What do you mean?" "We went together. Then he asked whether I wanted to have a little fun. I thought maybe he meant he was going to visit the Fornaces, so I told him no. But he was gone for so long, even Juba and the Praetorians couldn't find him." "None of them?" "Only 7 were with us." "So what did they do when he returned?" Alexander gave me a long look. "They warned him that if he ever did that again, our trips to the circus would be finished." "They must have been furious, but where did he say he went?" My brother turned up his palms, and I noticed how large his hands had grown. He was taller than me now. Women had begun to stare at him in the streets, and Julia liked to run her fingers through his hair and ask for his opinion on her tunics. I wondered what kind of husband he'd make, but couldn't bear the thought of being apart from him. What if Octavian decided to send him back to Egypt and keep me in Rome? Or, worse, send us to opposite ends of Rome's vast territories? He was watching me with the light amber eyes the two of us shared, and their expression was anxious. He didn't. Marcellus just elbowed me in the side and said, "You know." Is it possible he was the bowman, Selim? I thought back to the afternoon when the bull had been charging us, and I had caught only the briefest glimpse of a man on a balcony. His hair was golden, but I was too far away to see his face. Well, what if his performance in the ludus is just an act? What if he's smarter than any of us give him credit for? I thought of Marcellus, laughing, silly, always quick with a jibe, and shook my head. He's brash enough for it, but you've seen his writing in the ludus, Alexander. It can't be him. Handwriting can be disguised, but you're forgetting that there's Magister Varius as well. They both have the same light hair and eyes. Except Magister Varius wasn't the one who went missing. How do you know? He could have left the ludus as soon as we did. We stared at each other in the lamplight. Magister Varius, or Marcellus, I said. Julia has all but given him away. What do you think Octavian would do if it was Marcellus? Fear, as cold as ice, traveled down my spine. He would kill him, I said with certainty. My brother closed his eyes. You need to speak with her. He looked at me, and his gaze became intense. She needs to understand what she's done. I'm doing well, Thomas. How are you? Oh, you're from the UK. East Coast USA over here. Nice to meet you. As a reward for the information Julia had given him, Octavian allowed silks of every color to be brought to the Palatine, fresh from the barges of Ostia. Julia directed the merchants to Octavia's atrium, where Livia couldn't spoil the fun. But before she could begin choosing, I pulled her aside and whispered harshly, I hope you understand what these silks cost. Her black eyes widened innocently. I only told him the truth. You saw him too. He was probably a slave. He had hair like every other German or Gaul, with access to the Palatine and Capri, and rich enough to keep apartments across Rome. What slave do you know who has that kind of wealth? I don't understand. You're not that foolish, I said cruelly. Of course you do. There are only two men on the Palatine who fit that description, Magister Varius and Marcellus. She blinked slowly, as if considering it for the first time. Then her eyes filled with tears. No, it can't be. Why not? Yesterday, while we were at the Formboarium, Marcellus disappeared from the circus, and the gods only know where Magister Varius was. Her hand flew to her mouth. My father would never suspect them. Of course he would. And even if he didn't, then Juba would. He was there when Marcellus left, and even he couldn't find him. And Juba reports everything to your father. No, she backed away from me. It can't be Marcellus. Why wouldn't he tell me? I raised my brows, given what she'd already done. She panicked. But what does he care about slaves? He likes to gamble on horses and have fun. What about the Temple of Isis? I challenged. He cared about those slaves. Because they happen to cross paths. He's rash and foolish. And idealistic, I reminded her. Why, Celine? The distress on her face was real, and I almost felt sorry for her. Why did I have to tell my father? Whatever you do, keep your silence from now on. But what if it's too late? We both looked across the atrium to where Octavia and Claudia were marveling over the different silks. Neither of them appeared worried. We would know if Marcellus were being accused. But when the festival of Liberalia came, I wondered whether I was wrong. Octavian was an actor. If he wanted to hide his suspicions from his sister, how hard would it be? He appeared in time for Marcellus's dedication and seemed to be enjoying himself. He even led the way to the Laurarium, where Marcellus took off his bulla and offered it with wine and incense to the Lares, asking that the spirits guide his transition to manhood. But I noticed that Caesar's arm was around Tiberius's shoulders, and that Livia's mien was less dour than usual. Shall we proceed to the Capitol? Octavian asked jubilantly. There we go. Jeez. Julia was dressed in a silk tunic of the deepest red, and her hair was arranged in a golden net sewn with seed pearls. But even though Marcellus couldn't keep his eyes off her, she was pale with worry. What's the matter with my father? She whispered. Why is he so interested in Tiberius suddenly? I didn't know, and I didn't want to guess. You don't think... I put a finger to my lips. Not here. I held up my green tunic to keep the hem from getting dirty as we walked, and I shivered in the cool March wind. Would you like my cloak? Marcellus offered. Alexander is carrying one for me. Well, perhaps you should put it on. There are bumps up and down your arms. I felt embarrassed that he had noticed such an intimate thing. My brother handed me my cloak. We had purchased enough cloth from the merchants of Ostia to outfit a garrison, and Marcellus smiled when he saw me in my new silk. Very handsome. Julia's cloak is new as well, my brother pointed out. I glared at him. The princesses of the Palatine, Marcellus flattered, and what more fitting tribute to a pair of princesses than Liberalia? He was joking, of course. As we reached the bottom of the Palatine, a procession of boys passed by, pulling a cart with a towering statue of a phallus. What is that? I cried. Haven't you ever seen one? Tiberius asked snidely. The boys are the Salii, Julia said, ignoring him. Liberalia is a fertility festival. Like Bacchanalia, back home, my brother prompted. But what are they singing? No one knows, Marcellus said delightedly. The song is so old that the meaning has been forgotten. The young Salii were wearing the sort of bronze breastplates and shields that even Juba, who dealt in antiques, would have considered extremely old. No one had fought in such outfits for centuries, and I wondered how the boys could even walk. As the stone phallus rolled on in its cart, women tossed rose petals in the air, clapping and cheering as if the statue were the fertility god himself. Octavian had forbidden us from the festivities of Liberalia the previous March, telling us that we had only a few years to study in the ludus and the rest of our lives to celebrate Liber Pater and his splendid endowment. Now I saw what he meant. When we reached the capital, a second giant phallus had been decorated with flowers and mounted on the Tarpeian rock. Julia giggled, and Marcellus asked my brother what he thought it would be like to have a pair of collae that big. "Painful," he replied. "Not as painful as what's about to happen." Marcellus heaved a sigh. "Welcome to the tabularium." The tabularium was a solemn place, with a facade of peperino and tavertine blocks masking a stark interior of concrete vaults. It was the hall of records where Marcellus and Tiberius would proudly register themselves as citizens. But none of the men who passed us smiled. Liberalia meant nothing to them down here, where Rome's scrolls were guarded like gold, and the sun never penetrated its labyrinth of vaults. An old man in a toga took us into a chamber where the names of the most important clans in Rome were etched into the walls. He fetched the scrolls of the clans Julii and Claudii, and we waited in the dimly lit space while Marcellus and Tiberius read the names of the men who had come before them. A reed pen and ink were produced, and the old record-keeper instructed each of them to sign at the bottom of his clan's list. By the time we emerged into the sunshine, even Octavian had had enough of the gloom. "I should build a more cheerful office for them," he mused. "Would you like to make that your first contribution to Rome, Tiberius? I will give you the denarii to rebuild the tabularium." Tiberius was genuinely grateful. "I would like that very much." Julia returned my panicked look. Then Octavian approached Marcellus and clapped him heartily on the back. "And what about you? What will be your first contribution to Rome?" "How about a new circus?" Marcellus asked eagerly. Tiberius laughed. "Don't you think you gamble enough?" Octavian was displeased. "Perhaps there is something else you would prefer?" Marcellus looked desperately from his mother to his uncle, considering their passions. "What about a new theater?" Octavian smiled. "Better." Tiberius clenched his jaw, and I saw Marcellus exhale. "The theater of Marcellus. That shall be my gift to you. And Celine can design it." Everyone turned. I held my breath while Octavian regarded me with his inscrutable gray eyes. "How old are you now?" he asked suddenly. "My brother and I are 13. "A very mature 13, Octavia put in. "She designed the mosaic floor in the Temple of Apollo, and Vitruvius has her working on the Pantheon." Octavian shaded his eyes with his hand. "So why didn't Vitruvius tell this to me?" "Because she's a girl," Livia said, "and her place is at the loom." "It's a beautiful mosaic," Octavia retorted. "Girl or no, her skills are useful to him." Octavian considered this. "Where is he today?" "Working on the Pantheon," she told him. "After that it will be the Basilica of Neptune, the Septa Julia, your mausoleum, and my portico." Octavian turned his attention back to me. "When do you come up with these designs?" he asked curiously. "In the morning, before ludus. Vitruvius takes me with him sometimes." Octavian seemed to find this funny. "And what do you do?" "Measurements," I said firmly, refusing to let him dismiss my work. "I've also laid tiles." "What?" Livia sneered. "Like a mosaicist?" "Yes. If the mosaicist needs help or direction, I also want to learn for myself." Octavian regarded me for a moment. A princess who doesn't mind work. He looked meaningfully at both Marcellus and Julia. Something my own family can learn from. There was an uncomfortable silence before he added, "It sounds like Vitruvius is busy enough with his projects. If he wishes you to help with my nephew's theater, I see no problem with that." Livia's mouth worked into a tense line, but Marcellus smiled triumphantly at me. On our walk to the Forum, where he and Tiberius would exchange their boyhood togas for the white toga virilis, he whispered, That was very well done. What? I asked guilelessly. Your talk of laying tiles. My uncle tends to keep people around him who are useful. So you've said. And what about you? Around us, flutists played and children sang songs to Liber Pater and his consort Libera, whose blessings would make them fertile once they were married. In Alexandria, we knew Liber Pater as Bacchus, though I had never seen so many garlanded phalluses even in Bacchus's temple. Marcellus smiled conspiratorially at me, a flash of white teeth in a handsomely tanned face. I'm his sister's son, the heir and the spare. He glanced at Tiberius. Remember? Tiberius leaned over my shoulder and said softly, Be careful. Your secrets are making Julia jealous. I saw Marcellus tense, and when I looked behind me, Julia's eyes were hard as stone. That evening in the triclinium, she wanted to know what we'd been whispering about. Who your father will make his heir, I replied. A harpist began to play, for wealthy patricians and their young wives had come to celebrate the heir and the spare's coming of age. Julia moved closer to me on our dining couch. And do you think my father suspects Marcellus? He's giving him the denarii to build a theater. How suspicious could he be? She nodded slowly. So you weren't talking about the Red Eagle? I sat back. Why wouldn't I tell you? Maybe you think I'm not trustworthy anymore. If Marcellus ever said anything to me, you'd be the first to know. She watched me suspiciously. My father's a very good actor, she said. I've seen him lie to Livia as if his words were pure as gold. I'm not lying, I swore. I would tell you if I heard anything. Haven't you asked Marcellus yourself? Of course. He always denies it. Well, Marcellus never confides in me, I said glumly, and he talks to Alexander. This settled her a little. Just because my father was being generous today doesn't mean he isn't suspicious, she admitted, toying with her food. I had seen Julia lose her appetite only once before. Do you know what they call understudies on the stage? She didn't wait for me to answer. Shadows. And if my father has even the slightest suspicion that Marcellus isn't shadowing him, that will be the end. I will marry Tiberius, whether he's my stepbrother or not, and Marcellus will disappear. I realized she wasn't angry with me so much as she was angry with herself, and her eyes gleamed with tears. Perhaps he isn't the Red Eagle, I said hopefully. But Julia simply looked toward her father and didn't reply. In the hour before dawn, shouting echoed in the atrium. Then the sound of hobnailed boots filled the halls. For a moment I was in Egypt again, huddled with my brothers on my mother's bed on the day of her death. Alexander! I pushed away my covers. He jumped up. As we rushed to put on our cloaks, I could hear Marcellus's raised voice in the hall. Alexander flung open the door. Octavia, Vitruvius, Marcellus, and his sisters were standing in a circle outside Marcellus's chamber, watching the soldiers move in and out of the room. When Marcellus saw us, his face lost its color. Agrippa was there. We found him at the circus, he said, in the fornaces. Octavia covered her mouth with her hand. It's not what you think, Marcellus protested. So then, what were you doing? Octavian emerged from Marcellus's chamber, and his look was violent. Not writing acta, I hope. Marcellus stepped back. Is that what this is about? You think I'm the Red Eagle? I could see he wanted to laugh, and might have if the accusation hadn't been so serious. Because I leave at night to visit a few lupae, you think I'm a traitor? Octavia shrieked. You were visiting dirty lupae? Vitruvius put a calming hand on her arm. Every boy has been there. Not the heir of Rome, Octavian shouted. Juba appeared from Marcellus's chamber, wiping his hands on his tunic. What did you find? Octavian demanded. Just a few lewd paintings. I told you, Marcellus cried. You've seen my work in the ludus. Do you think I could really be responsible for the acta? I don't have the patience. Octavian considered this. Perhaps you are too secure in the belief that you will be my heir. Remember, Marcellus, I loved Fidelius as well, he said, reminding him of the young soldier he had killed outside the walls of Rome. Then he turned to his sister. Keep a better watch on your child. The halls emptied of soldiers, and when Octavian's men were gone, Marcellus moved toward his mother. I don't want to see you, she cried, pushing him away. But it's not what you think. Mother, just listen. He leaned over and whispered something in her ear that made her step back and look at him anew. Please don't tell Octavian, he begged. Everyone, back to your rooms, Octavia ordered. Go to sleep. But the vestibulum was suddenly filled with a woman's cries for help, and everyone froze. It's Gallia, Marcellus said, recognizing her voice. I'll bet they've taken Magister Varius. He glared at his mother. I guess any blonde on the Palatine will do. Gallia burst into the hall, looking as if she had just run all the way from her house at the bottom of the Palatine. In a weeping tirade, she confirmed Marcellus's fears. What has he done? Was it something he taught? No, Marcellus said angrily. There's information that the Red Eagle looks like a Gaul, but they haven't found him yet. So now anyone with light hair is suspect. Gallia looked to Octavia. It's true, she said quietly. My brother was here searching Marcellus's chamber. She gasped. His own nephew? Octavia raised her chin. No one is above suspicion. Gallia put her head in her hands. Even that night at Gaius's villa she hadn't wept, but the sobs that racked her body made everyone turn away. Her own pain hadn't been enough to break her, but now that it was Magister Varius. Octavia put her arm around Gallia's shoulders and told Vitruvius to fetch some blankets. We followed her through the hall into the library. There would be no ludus in the morning, and there was no use telling us to go to sleep. A slave arrived to light the brazier, and we sat together around the fire, drinking warm wine and huddling in our cloaks. Marcellus looked the worse for his night. He's probably been taken to the carcer, Octavia guessed. They'll search his rooms, and when they don't find anything to suggest he's a traitor, they'll set him free. But she hesitated. He isn't a traitor, is he? Gallia put down her cup more loudly than she probably intended. I have lived with him for nearly a year. I think I would know if he was the Red Eagle. Octavia nodded. Then once they're finished going through his scrolls, so let them read. I hope they enjoy Simonides and Homer. The fire crackled in the brazier, and an uneasy silence settled over the library. Vitruvius returned with blankets and warm au filet, but no one felt much like eating. As dawn broke over the sky, doing its best to lighten the leaden clouds, little Tonia put her head in her mother's lap. It's time for ludus, she said. Why aren't they going? Because there's not going to be any ludus today. Antonia, take your sister back to your chamber. Although I would certainly have argued with my own mother, Antonia rose quietly and did as she was told. The ensuing stillness in the room felt crushing. Did you hear about the theater? Octavia asked to fill the silence. Vitruvius nodded. Caesar has approved of Selene's help, he said quietly. I look forward to seeing her ideas. The conversation lapsed into silence, and just as my eyes were becoming too heavy to keep open, a shadow darkened the hallway. Varius! Gallia cried. She rushed from her seat and threw her arms around his neck, searching his face for signs of torture. He wasn't there long, Juba assured her. The soldiers searched his rooms and didn't find anything. Of course they didn't, Gallia said harshly. What did they do to you? She asked tenderly. Nothing. Juba arrived to get me out before they could even put me in chains. Tears dampened Gallia's cheeks. Thank you, Juba. So nothing was found tonight, Octavia cut in angrily. Not here, not in the ludus, and not in Magister Varius's home. Juba's gaze did not waver. Those were my orders. And what have you been ordered to do next? She demanded. inform you that Octavian is resigning from office. Chapter 16, 27 to 26 BC. By the next day, there was no one in Rome who hadn't heard the news. Thousands of people flocked to the Senate, where Octavian had promised to relinquish his powers and resign his office in its entirety. Soldiers kept peace in the courtyard outside, where the men looked solemn and a few hysterical women were beating their chests. We stood around the open doors of the Senate, where a space had been cleared for us, and I heard Octavius say, "Make way!" Vitruvius appeared with a young man at his side, and for a terrible moment I wondered if he had taken a new apprentice. "Alexander, Selene, my son, Lucius," he said. Lucius gave me a dazzling smile. He was shorter than my brother, but, like Octavian, he had small heels on his bright golden sandals. When I extended my hand, his kiss lingered. "So you are the one who is bearing my burden," he said gratefully. "Without you, I would be chained to ink drawings and cement." I laughed. "It is a pleasant burden," I told him. "Well, with someone as pretty as you watching over them, the builders must be begging for more work." Marcellus laughed at this empty flattery, but Lucius just turned his attention to my brother. "Alexander, there he is," Marcellus interrupted, pointing through the open doors into the Senate. "He's taken the podium." Octavian was dressed in a plain white toga, and nothing on his person gave any indication that he was Caesar. He was flanked by Juba and Agrippa, and behind them stood the Praetorian Guard. Although Alexander and Lucius were whispering, everyone else in the courtyard was silent. I had asked Julia whether her father was going to do this because of the Red Eagle, but she'd only laughed. There's nothing he does without planning it first. He's probably considered this for months, years. "Then you don't think he plans on giving up his power?" Julia had given me a wearied look. "No," she'd said with a practiced cynicism. "He would only be doing this if he thought it would increase it." I didn't see how resigning his office would make Octavian more powerful than he already was, but as he rose to speak, the senators began to revolt. They shouted for him to remain, citing the civil wars that had ripped Rome apart before he had taken power, and swearing that this would happen again if he refused. Men pumped their fists in the air, cursing like sailors from Ostia, but Octavian raised his arms and the room fell silent. "It is time," he shouted, "for me to give up the reins of power and return the republic to the citizens of Rome." "He can't mean that," Marcellus exclaimed. Octavia twisted her belt strings nervously in her hands, but Livia was smiling, and I thought, Julia's right. He doesn't mean that. I believe we all remember my adoptive father, Gaius Julius Caesar, who stood before you only 17 years ago in the purple robes of Imperium, with a laurel wreath on his head. Notice that I come to you before you with none of the trappings of Caesar. I am a humble servant, one who remembers his history well. "Then you remember the civil wars," a senator shouted. "Yes," Octavian conceded, "but I also remember my father," he said harshly, "stabbed to death for attempting to build an empire." There was pandemonium in the Senate. A young boy in the doorway repeated Octavian's words for those standing in the courtyard, and the frenzy outside soon matched the turmoil within. Octavian raised his arms, and again the senators fell silent. "Having done what I can for Rome," he went on, "I now lay down my office in its entirety. To you, the esteemed senators of Rome, I return authority over the army, the laws, and the provinces. You are free to govern not just those territories which you entrusted to me, but also those which I fought and won for you." Seneca leapt violently from his seat. "This is not acceptable," he cried. "You fought against Antony. You crushed the kingdom of Egypt. You rebuilt our city and sent forces to police our dangerous hills. You took a republic in chaos and made it into an empire, and we will never allow you to resign." Vitruvius turned to Octavia. "Is he paying Seneca?" She shook her head. "I don't know." He doesn't have to pay him, Livia snapped. The senators don't want to return to civil war. Without Octavian's leadership, the clans will go back to fighting and tearing each other apart like wolves. Let us take a vote, one of the senators shouted. There were hums of approval, and Octavian raised his hands. Then I submit my departure to you, he acquiesced. Seneca addressed the chamber. We are voting on the future of Rome, he said. There is not a man here who doesn't know what Octavian has done for this city, for this empire, for all of you. Do you want to return to the days of anarchy, the days of civil war? He threatened. Octavian is not another Julius Caesar. He's something different. This is different. We can share power, and for the first time in history of Rome, create a joint way of ruling. So let us give him a name in honor of his difference, of his victories, and his sacrifices to build a better Rome. Let us call Gaius Octavius Augustus. There was a roar of approval from the senators, and only a few men remained seated on the benches. From the platform, Octavian bent his head humbly. Livia looked toward the sky. He's done it, she murmured. The gods seemed to have been watching over her. He's made himself emperor. The senators resumed their seats, and only Seneca remained standing. As for leaving office, he continued, and a chorus of protest met the words, we shall have a vote as to whether Augustus shall be allowed to resign. It was a grand piece of theater, and when all of it was done, we watched as Octavian reluctantly accepted control over the provinces of Syria, Iberia, and Gaul for 10 years. Egypt would still belong to him, and the command of more than 20 legions, all was his as well. But the rest of the provinces and their comparatively small legions would be governed by the Senate, and they would be allowed to choose which praetors would oversee them. The celebration in the streets that followed was as loud and wild as any military triumph. It was as if Augustus were coming home again, victorious from battle. In Octavia's villa that afternoon, we prepared for a celebratory feast. Gallia arranged my curls into a loose bun and slipped pearl-tipped pins into my hair. I imagined how beautiful the pins would have looked with my mother's necklace, then commanded myself not to think about it. Gallia's freedom and happiness was worth any number of necklaces, and no necklace could bring my mother back. Gallia swept the slightest hint of malachite across my lids, then allowed me to wear a pair of pearl earrings Julia had given me for Saturnalia. When Alexander saw me, he hummed with appreciation. Be careful, he teased. All of those senators will be here tonight, and they're probably tired of looking at Octavian. Did you even hear what was happening? I asked critically, or did you spend the entire time talking with Lucius? Of course I heard. He's kept his power for 10 more years, and we're all to call him Augustus. I looked up at Gallia. Is it true? Will even Octavia call him that? Yes, Romans are always changing their names. I thought of the mausoleum that Vitruvius had already started to build, and all of the inscriptions that would have to be changed. So do you think he planned this? Alexander asked, seating himself next to me at the mirror while Gallia perfumed my neck. Julia says he did. So does Lucius. And what does Lucius know? I demanded. He lives with his aunt. My brother raised his brows. Not any more. He's been talking to his father. Octavia has said he can come and live here. He's quite the charmer. We sat together in silence for a moment, and then I glanced in the mirror. Do you really think I look pretty? Enough to turn every head in the triclinium, he promised. And me? I laughed. You're always handsome. And what does it matter? There's no one who you have your eye on. He smiled uneasily. Is there? No, he confirmed. It would be foolish to begin anything. We don't know what Augustus has in mind for us. He could give you to a senator as old as Zeus, and me to a witch like Livia. Don't say that, I whispered. It's true. That's why Lucius won't stay with his aunt. She thinks she's found a wife for him, some horrible hag with a villa in Capri, and he's only a year older than we are. When will he come here? I asked. This evening. So quickly? The more time he spends with her, my brother said, the more time she has to bring women home to meet him. But Vitruvius has to approve my marriage. Lucius says Vitruvius trusts his sister's judgment. So does he think he'll escape marriage by coming here? Perhaps. Not every man marries, you know. Maecenas didn't have a wife for years, and Virgil's in his 40s and has never married. They are poets, Alexander, and probably Ganymedes. But my brother didn't seem bothered by the reference to the handsome Trojan boy who was abducted to Olympus to become the lover of Zeus. He simply shrugged. Maybe. For the rest of the night I studied Alexander. Even when Marcellus poured my wine and complimented me on my earrings, I watched the way my brother talked, how Julia laughed at everything he said, and how Alexander's eyes never left Lucius. The only time their gazes were parted was when Augustus stood from his couch in the triclinium and declared that tomorrow another startling announcement would be made. Julia shook her head. If my father wasn't consul, he'd be an actor. Is there a difference? Marcellus asked, and I detected a note of bitterness in his voice. He said he had forgiven his uncle for accusing him of treachery, but I wondered whether he could forgive him for sending guards to pull him out of the fornaces. What do you think he'll announce? I whispered. I looked to Julia and Marcellus, but it was Lucius who spoke. War. When everyone turned to him, he added, My father says that Augustus wants a new triumphal arch. When he was asked what it was for, he said his continued battle against Gaul and war in Asturias and Cantabria. Vitruvius never told this to me, I said, hurt. Augustus only asked for the arch this morning. There is rebellion in Gaul, Marcellus conceded, and the Asturians have gold, while the Cantabri have iron. They'd be valuable territories, not to mention that Cantabria is the last independent nation in Iberia that isn't Roman. We all looked at Octavian, bundled in his warmest winter toga and fur-trimmed cloak, despite the mildness of March's weather. If he goes to war, Julia confided, I only hope he takes Livia along with him. On the Ides of April, Julia got her wish. Not only was Livia going to travel with Augustus on the campaign to put down the Gallic rebellion, so were Juba, Tiberius, and Marcellus. You can't go, Julia said desperately, watching Marcellus pack for what might be 2, even 3 years abroad. He laughed. It's only Gaul. Do you remember how many legions have been there before? But anything could happen. Why risk yourself like this? Because someday, if this is ever my empire, I will have to go to war alone, without your father, or his generals, or Juba. And Agrippa? Lucius asked. He sat next to my brother on Marcellus's couch, where a heavy chest was being filled with sandals and clothes. Since he had moved into the villa and started attending the ludus with us, he and my brother had become inseparable, working on their poetry together, gambling at dice, even betting on the same horses in the circus. I didn't understand my brother's fascination with him, yet Julia found the pair of them irresistible, laughing like a hyena whenever the 3 of them were together. He'll stay behind to govern Rome, Marcellus said. My brother started, but isn't he the architect of my father's wars? Yes, Marcellus replied, but someone needs to watch over the Senate. Agrippa went to Egypt, I pointed out, and every man who wanted Rome for himself was on the battlefield. Now they're dressed in togae praetexta and call themselves senators. I was impressed by Marcellus's eagerness. Tomorrow he would be riding out with 5 legions to a war from which he might never return. Yet there was only excitement in his voice. I thought of the dangers he would face and the painted Gallic fighters hiding in the thickly wooded passes. I was sure that Isis would never be so cruel as to abandon someone so young and filled with promise. But then why had she abandoned Ptolemy and Caesarion? Where had she been when Antyllus was murdered at the base of Caesar's statue, and my parents lost their kingdom to a thin, weak sapling of a man? There were tears from nearly everyone the next morning. Julia clung to Marcellus and wept. Then he whispered something in her ear and tenderly wiped away her tears with his finger. When he came to me, he didn't whisper anything. I was ashamed to admit how afraid I was that he would never come back, but I refused to weep like a child. "What? No tears?" Juba asked. "He's about to fight the fearsome Gauls and Cantabri." "Isis will watch over him," I said firmly. "Perhaps she can use her wings to fly us to Gaul," Tiberius laughed. "Then we won't have to worry about the barbarians hiding in the trees along the road." "Enough," Livia said, and for once I was thankful to her. I could feel the sting of tears in my eyes, and Juba watched me curiously while Marcellus straddled his favorite horse. The Campus Martius was filled with onlookers waiting for the soldiers to begin their march so they could scatter laurel branches in their path. I was standing close enough to the horses to overhear Livia whisper to Tiberius, "I'll be in the carriage. If anything happens, you know what to do." "Of course," he said curtly. "And you won't be fool enough to stand in the way of any arrow meant for Marcellus. If the gods wish him to die, you must not challenge their will." Tiberius looked at me and saw that I was eavesdropping. I looked away. Livia walked to Octavia and kissed her sister-in-law good-bye. "A safe journey," Octavia said without conviction. Livia smiled. "Don't worry for Marcellus. He's a capable man. And of course, I'll watch over him like a son." I almost protested, but Octavia had wept all morning, and now the tears came afresh. From atop his horse, Marcellus passed her a small square of linen, which she pressed to her nose. "It's nothing, mother. A short fight, and then it's over." Octavia nodded, pretending to believe him, and as the legions moved out, Alexander put his arm around my waist. "He'll be back," he promised. "How do you know?" "Because Juba and Agrippa have trained him." I watched Juba mount his horse. He had saved both Gallia and me from death, and I felt certain he would do the same for Marcellus. Women whistled in his direction, raising their tunics above the knee, and I suspected that some of them were Lupe. "Why are they interested in him?" I demanded. "Because he's handsome," Alexander said. I gave him a look. "It's true," he admitted. "You may not like him, but the women of Rome obviously do." I supposed that Juba was somewhat attractive. His hair was thick and long, a rich color as dark as his eyes. His muscled thighs were exposed on the horse, and I imagined that his chest was just as handsomely sculpted. But he would never have the same easy laugh as Marcellus. There was no one like Marcellus, and as I blinked back my tears, my brother patted my shoulder. "Augustus doesn't want anything to happen to him. Marcellus won't see any of the dangerous fighting. But it'll be lonely in the ludus," he said understandingly. "And the circus, and the triclinium. At least you have Julia." She was my only consolation as the long months passed, and Saturnalia approached without any hint that the soldiers would be returning home. We wandered the holiday markets together with Gallia and 7 of the Praetorian guards, but it was strange without Marcellus's constant chatter, and with no one to look pretty for. "When Marcellus returns home," Julia said, pausing above a wide selection of wigs, "perhaps I'll be blonde." I laughed. "What, like a lupa?" "No, like Gallia. Look at how beautiful she is." "Because I am light," she told Julia, "with blue eyes and pale skin. You are a Roman. Dark is your color." Julia pouted. "Then how will I surprise him?" I glanced in the mirror above the shopkeeper's head, wondering whether I would look good with golden hair. But the thought of wearing a slave girl's shorn-off tresses turned my stomach. "Marcellus is not for me," I thought firmly. "If he comes home safe, it will be to Julia." But I couldn't help feeling just a little triumphant that I would have something more than a new wig to show him when he returned. The construction of the theater had already begun near Octavia's portico, and when given a choice of designs, I had asked Vitruvius to build something like the circus, with 3 stories of arches veneered in white travertine and topped by Corinthian columns. He was allowing me to sketch almost every mosaic and all of the important friezes inside. I picked up one of the shopkeeper's statuettes and smiled to myself. What? Are you thinking of worshipping Roman gods now? I looked down and realized that I was holding a statuette of Mars. Of course not! I put down the statuette at once. Julia laughed. He looks like Agrippa, doesn't he? The round marble face and short cropped hair did look a little like him. He must be a very loyal man, I remarked. All of this time your father has been gone, and he's never once betrayed him in the Senate. Agrippa would lay down his life for my father. His eldest brother chose the wrong side in the war against Julius Caesar. He fought alongside Cato, if you imagine, and when Cato was defeated, Julius Caesar took Agrippa's brother as a prisoner. It was my father who intervened and saved his life. So Agrippa feels as though he owes him, Julia said. Sometimes he comes to our villa just to check on Drusus and me. Of course, there's the Praetorian Guard to watch over us, but he comes anyway. She lowered her voice. And he never betrayed me that night in the circus. I paused. What night? When my father went searching through Marcellus's room thinking he was the Red Eagle, Agrippa found us renting a room near the fornaces and never told my father that I was there as well. There was a sudden pressure on my chest so hard that it hurt to breathe. You're the one Marcellus was sneaking out to meet? Julia giggled. Didn't your brother tell you? No! Well, you should talk to him more often. When we returned to the Palatine, I stormed into my chamber, startling Lucius and Alexander at their work. What's the matter? My brother asked. Shopping didn't go well? You lied to me. He scrambled to his seated position on the couch, scattering his scrolls from the ludus. About what? You never told me Marcellus was meeting with Julia in the fornaces. I just found out. Julia only told me a few weeks ago. Weeks? I cried. And were you ever going to tell me? He was waiting for the right time. I glared at Lucius. So you know about this as well? My brother tells you everything, but keeps his own twin in the dark? It wasn't meant to be that way, Alexander argued. Then how was it meant to be? Alexander moved across the room and shut the door. He was meeting with her. I knew it would hurt you, and I didn't want to see you upset. So better to see me embarrassed, I said heatedly. Better that I learn about it while shopping in the Forum. Then another thought occurred to me. So Marcellus isn't the Red Eagle. It's still possible, my brother said. Haven't you noticed that since he's been gone, not a single actum has been put up? It could also mean the rebel is smart enough to make it look like him. I crossed my arms over my chest. I'm sorry, Celine, my brother said quietly. I wonder how long they've been. Only a few months before he left, he assured me. Before then, he was seeing a lupa. I gasped. Everyone's done it. Have you? I challenged. Of course not me. He glanced at Lucius. I mean, everyone else. I seated myself and closed my eyes, wishing that if I kept them shut, I would never have to see Alexander or Lucius or Marcellus's bright face when he returned and whispered into Julia's ear. Lucius perched himself on the arm of my chair, and I opened my eyes. Come with us to the Odeum today, he said. Yes, Alexander replied, you never come, and you're the one who professes to like poetry. Since Lucius had moved into Octavia's villa, my brother had begun going with him to the local Odeia. The little covered theaters hosted musical competitions and poetry readings. And since Marcellus had left, my brother was visiting the Odeia even more frequently than the circus. Come on, Alexander pleaded. The one on the campus is the prettiest little theater you've ever seen. It might even give you some ideas, Lucius prompted. Ovid is going to be there, my brother said temptingly. And who is Ovid? Alexander and Lucius looked at each other. Just the greatest young poet in Rome, Lucius cried. Come with us. He took my arm, and I allowed myself to be led to the Campus Martius, where a small stone building welcomed visitors with a handsome mosaic and an ivy-covered arch. because it was nearly Saturnalia, and a green and saffron canopy fluttered over the crossbeams, invoking the colors of fertility and protecting the patrons from the December drizzle. Two men of the Praetorian Guard took seats behind us, and Alexander explained what was about to happen. "Today is for poetry," he said. "You see the young man with the red cheeks waiting to go on stage? That's Ovid." "How old is he?" I exclaimed. 16. "And his family lets him perform?" "Not everyone's father refuses to acknowledge the value of literature," Lucius said. "What about Horace and Virgil?" I asked. Alexander wrinkled his nose. "Augustus owns them. All they write is politics now. Ovid writes about what's real." When I frowned, Lucius said, "Love," then added quickly, "and love's pain." I crossed my arms. "And you think I want to hear about love's pain?" "Shh," Alexander said. "Just listen." Ovid took the stage, and immediately the patrons of the Odeum hushed. This was not like Octavian's theater performances, where men stood from their seats and threw dates at the actors and chanted, "Bring on the bear!" The audience was composed mostly of young men. A few women sat with their friends, giggling and pointing, but everyone grew silent when Ovid declared, "I call this disappointment." Several men chuckled. "Why is that funny?" I whispered. "Because he's always talking about his triumphs," my brother said. Then Ovid began. "But oh, I suppose she was ugly. She wasn't elegant. I hadn't yearned for her often in my prayers. Yet holding her I was limp, and nothing happened at all. I just lay there, a disgraceful load for her bed. I wanted it, she did too, and yet no pleasure came from the part of my sluggish loins that should bring joy. The girl entwined her ivory arms around my neck, her arms were whiter than the Sithonian snow, and gave me greedy kisses, thrusting her fluttering tongue, and laid her eager thigh against my thigh, and whispering fond words, calling me the lord of her heart, and everything else that lovers murmur in joy. And yet, as if chill hemlock were smeared upon my body, my numb limbs would not act out my desire. I lay there like a log, a fraud, a worthless weight. My body might as well have been a shadow. What will my age be like, if old age ever comes, when even my youth cannot fulfill its role?" The audience laughed uproariously, and Ovid continued, "Ah, I am ashamed of my years. I'm young and a man. So what? I was neither young nor man in my girlfriend's eyes. She rose like the sacred priestess who tends the undying flame, or a sister who's chastely lain at a dear brother's side. But not long ago blonde Childe twice, fair Pytho 3 times, and Libas 3 times I enjoyed without a pause. Corina, as I recall, required my services 9 times in one short night, and I obliged. Has some Thessalian potion made my body limp, injuring me with noxious spells and herbs? Did some witch hex my name, scratched on crimson wax, and stab right through the liver with slender pins?" He went on to describe the shame of not performing, and I stared at my brother in disbelief. When Ovid was finished, the entire audience was on its feet. Alexander turned to me. "Well, what do you think?" "It's disgusting and crass. Is this all he does?" "You didn't like it?" Lucius exclaimed, wiping the tears of laughter from his eyes. "He has other material, too," he promised. "Entire odes to his mistress Corina." "The one he took 9 times?" I asked dryly. "It's meant to be satire," my brother said. "I thought you'd find it funny." "Perhaps I'm not in the mood." "But the theater is handsome, isn't it?" he asked. Grudgingly, I admitted that it was. For a little stone building crushed between 2 shops in the campus marshes, it had a certain charm. It wasn't anything our mother would have frequented in Alexandria, and she would never have condoned our enjoying coarse Latin poetry in a Roman theater with golden bullae around our necks. But then our mother was gone, and Egypt had been swept up in Augustus's new empire. Marcellus had been all that made my exile bearable. When I listened to him laughing in the halls of the villa or shouting at the teens in the Circus Maximus, I could forget for a while that Charmian and Ptolemy were dead, that I would never return to Egypt, and that my father's memory had been expunged from Rome. Alexander and Lucius tried their best to cheer me. Lost my place. Never mind. And for a while there was news from Egypt that seemed hopeful. Cornelius Gallus, the poet and politician who Augustus had set up as prefect over my mother's kingdom, had fallen from favor and committed suicide. What better time to turn to me and Alexander than now, when Egypt was without a leader? But news arrived just as swiftly from Gaul that a new prefect had been found. So even as Saturnalia came and went, I found little to be happy about. When my brother and I had our 14th birthday on the 1st of January, Julia presented me with a pair of beautiful gold and emerald earrings, but her generosity did nothing but irk me. "We should go to the Forum," she said eagerly, "and pick out a silk tunic to match them." "And who would I wear it for?" I demanded, ruining the light mood in the triclinium, where Octavia had hung Saturn's sacred holly branches from the ceiling, and their waxy leaves reflected the lamplight. Julia frowned. "What do you mean? For yourself? For Lucius?" "All Lucius does is stare at my brother." Julia looked at the pair of them rolling dice in the corner of the triclinium. "So do you think they're more than friends?" she asked. I looked at her aghast. "Of course not." "They spend all their time together," she pointed out. "So do we," I whispered, "and I'm not your lover. Marcellus is." She glanced swiftly at Octavia. "Please don't tell her, Celine. She would never forgive me if she knew. Please." I wanted to reply with something cutting, to tell her that Octavia knew already, but the need in her eyes was too urgent. And why was it her fault that she was the one destined for Marcellus and not I? "So you don't like the earrings?" she asked hesitantly. "Of course I do." I attempted a smile. "They're beautiful." "Then we'll shop for something to match them tomorrow." I tried to be in a better mood when we went to the Forum. Even though the weather was grim and a cold mist hung over the streets, I followed Gallia down the street in my warmest cloak. "At least it's not snowing," Julia said. "Imagine what it must be like in the mountains of Gaul." "How cold does it get there?" I asked Gallia. "Very bitter," she replied. "When the snow falls, even the animals go into hiding. Every year there are children who starve for lack of food, and the old women without families are prey for the wolves." Julia shivered. "No wonder my father's letters are so pitiful. He's sick all the time, and weak." "The Gallic winters can do that." "If he is wise," Gallia said, "he will leave his most hardy men there and take the rest south toward Cantabria." Julia looked at me, and I knew she was thinking of Marcellus. Somewhere in the cold mountain ranges of Gaul he was suffering with Juba, Augustus, and Tiberius. Their men were probably wishing for the comforts of home, where holly hung in the bright sprigs on their doorpost, and the rich scent of cooked goose filled their halls. Some of them would never live to see another Saturnalia, and I wondered how Livia was managing in such a bitter place. "Probably just fine," I thought acerbically. "She has Augustus all to herself, and Tarantilla is 800 miles away." When we reached the Forum, Julia wrapped her cloak tighter around her chest. "Perhaps we should have left this for another time. Let's take the short cut," she suggested. Gallia led the way through the Senate courtyard, where, despite the bitter weather, lawyers were arguing a trial. The heavily dressed men stood at two separate podiums, shielded from the light rain by a thin canopy. A crowd of onlookers had gathered, and I pulled at Julia's cloak. "Do you think we should see what's happening?" "In this weather?" she exclaimed. "But look at all the people. It might be another trial like the one for the slaves of Gaius Fabius." Julia hesitated, torn between the warmth of the shops and curiosity. "Only for a moment, and only if it's good." We stood behind the platform in the space reserved for senators and members of what was now the imperial family. A young defendant had been placed between two soldiers, but it was obvious from her clothes that she was no plebe. The fur of her cloak brushed her soft cheeks, and the sandals on her feet were new and made of leather. Her long braid had been threaded carefully with gold, and no man would have passed her on the street without thinking that she was pretty. It was her lawyer's turn to speak at the podium, and she listened with downcast eyes. "You have heard Aquila's lawyer tell you that this girl was once his slave," he said angrily. "You have heard him lie like a dog from his mouth, and say that she was stolen from him as an infant. So how can Aquila tell that this girl is the same child he purchased 15 years ago? Does she have the same plump cheeks?" he demanded, "the same fat legs and ear-piercing cry?" The crowd in front of him laughed a little. "And why has Aquila suddenly come forward now, claiming that she is his former slave? Could it be that she is pretty?" The crowd shook their heads in disapproval, and a heavy man in a fur cloak narrowed his eyes at them. Could it be that he has lusted after Tullia for months, and knowing that she is the daughter of an honorable centurion, he has decided that this is the only way to have her? "Liar!" the lawyer for Aquila shouted. "I can prove to you that I am not lying. This girl you see before you has never been a slave, and I will bring a dozen people who witnessed her birth and who will vouch for her identity." "And who are these people?" Aquila's lawyer challenged. "Slaves who can easily be bought off?" "Not as easily as Judices," Tullia's lawyer retorted, and there was a stiffening of backs among the seated men. "It's true. The midwives of Rome are slaves, but I will bring you her mother, her father, even her aunts, and you will see the resemblance." "They can see a resemblance between you and me," Aquila's lawyer scoffed. "See, we both have short hair and dark skin. Does that make me your child?" Several of the Judices laughed, and an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. "Tomorrow I will bring witnesses," Tullia's lawyer promised, "and when this case must be decided, I ask that you use reason. What man would wait 15 years before bringing charges of kidnapping? Why Tullia? Why now? And remember," he warned ominously, "that the next time a man wants to abuse a pretty citizen, she could be your sister, your daughter, even your wife." The Judices rose, and the crowd began to disperse. "It's over?" Julia exclaimed. "Why not bring the witnesses today?" "Because it's beginning to rain heavily now," Gallia pointed out. Neither Julia nor I had noticed. We watched the soldiers escort the girl from the platform, and the eyes of the man in fur watched her hotly. She avoided his gaze, looking instead at the weeping woman still standing in the rain. Her mother, I thought sadly. Next to the woman, a broad-shouldered centurion placed his hand on his heart in a silent promise. The girl seemed to tremble, then her legs gave way beneath her. "Tullia!" the man shouted, and I was sure he was her father. The soldiers lifted her swiftly back onto her feet, and the centurion spun around to the fat man in furs. "I will kill you!" Her father lunged, but several soldiers moved quickly to stop him. "Let the Judices decide," Tullia's lawyer pleaded. "He's paid them off," the father accused. "Even the lawyer knows that their pockets are filled with this maggot's gold." Aquila straightened his cloak. "Be careful," he warned. "Masters can discard slaves who are no longer useful to them." I swallowed some spit. Oh, man. The two men stared at each other for a moment. Then the centurion hissed, "If I were you, I'd watch myself. Even maggots have to sleep." More soldiers rushed to separate them, splashing through the mud before violence could be done. "We must come back tomorrow," Julia said suddenly. "You will not like it," Gallia warned. "The Judices have been bought." "How do you know? You saw their faces. Who were those men laughing for?" "Aquila's lawyer," Julia realized. "But that isn't fair." Gallia turned up her palm. "It is foolish to think that rot can be confined to a single fruit. Once slavery is planted, everything decays." We didn't do much shopping. The rain was falling in heavy gray sheets, and when we reached the top of a wealthy silk merchant, we huddled around his sandalwood brazier until the rain subsided, and we could go out again. Julia purchased a few bolts of cloth in acknowledgment of his hospitality, and instructed him to send the bill to Augustus. That evening, in Octavia's triclinium, Julia described what we'd seen in the forum. As she came to the part about the Judices being bought, Octavia sucked in her breath. The Judices of Rome are men from honorable patrician families. I'm only repeating what the lawyer said. And isn't it suspicious that a man would wait 15 years before claiming one of the prettiest girls in Rome as his slave? Vitruvius asked. Can it really be said that all patricians are honorable? Perhaps we should go tomorrow, Agrippa suggested. He looked at his wife. I wouldn't mind the rain, Claudia replied. We could dress warmly, and our presence might inspire Judices to act on their consciences. I was surprised by the simplicity of her thinking. Assuming the Judices had been bought, no one's presence would speak louder than gold. Agrippa might appear on one day for the trial, but how long would it hold his attention? And what would he do if the Judices ruled that Tullia was Aquila's slave? As Octavia had said, they were men from honorable families. Charging them with corruption would be a heavy thing. All right. That brings us to the conclusion of our reading for the evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me on this Friday in my area. Friday night. Could be Saturday morning for all I know, for where you are. But thank you for joining us. We'll pick up our reading again on Tuesday. Same time, same place, 8 to 9:30. Tuesday. I'll see you guys then. You're welcome, Miss Deborah. We'll see you Tuesday.